everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation. I'm happy to see so many familiar faces and new ones as well. Tonight, we are joined by someone I'm sure many of you already know, Kenny Sholes. Each third Thursday of the month, Kenny joins us with a new historic property lecture, sharing the hidden stories behind properties many of you may pass every day. This month, he will be talking about the history of slavery in the Ag Reserve. Reminder, please remain muted during the presentation. As always, you can send any questions you have throughout in the chat, and there will always be an opportunity at the end to unmute for a Q&A. If you enjoyed tonight's program, make sure to check out our website and register to join us for more upcoming events. Without further ado, Kenny, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Dottie. It's great to see you all here tonight. Apologies for not being here last month. So some of you know, in addition to some of the history work I've been doing, I have a full-time job, believe it or not, and then also a small side business helping families navigate the college admissions process. And this time of year is absolutely crazy as I continue to push our seniors to get their applications completed. And last month, my schedule just kind of got away from me and prevented me from being here with you all. So I'm glad to be back this month. What I'm going to talk about tonight, as Dottie mentioned, is slavery here in the Ag Reserve, here even in some cases specifically here in Poolesville. But I think me talking about it first deserves a little bit of context. I'm very interested in this topic. I'm very interested in the formation and evolution of the historic Black communities in and around Poolesville. And it's something that I've been looking into and thinking about and talking with others about. And people have said, you should write more about it or talk more about it. And I'm interested in doing that. And there are, of course, many, many stories to be told there. But I would say that I feel very conflicted as a white guy studying this issue about whether or not it's truly appropriate for me to take on those issues in some circumstances. The reality is that despite the fact that I was born here in Poolesville and have lived here and lived back here with my my family, the experience of those who grew up and lived in and continue to be part of our Black communities around Poolesville had a lived experience that I just cannot even pretend to replicate or tell in any way. But about 2 weeks ago, I got reached out to by a group, and there are two church congregations here in town, one that is predominantly white and the other that is predominantly Black. And since last summer, with a lot of the racial equality, protests and discussions taking place, these two congregations came together and they started to have some discussions and I guess somewhat frequent meetings to talk about various issues around race, but also around faith and religion and, local town issues. How to best address some, various things that they felt needed to be fixed in these parts or could be worked upon. And they are meeting in a few weeks, and they asked me if I would come and speak about the formation of the Black communities around town. And I essentially responded with, saying, A, very flattered and would be honored to do that. However, B, kind of provided the same concern that I just mentioned, which is, am I really the best person to kind of be talking about this? And I know that you all have had Chuck Copeland here talking about Martinsburg. And I know Skip Etheridge has done some talks about the Sugarland community, right? And of course, those guys are going to be much better at being able to really provide an in-depth look at those specific communities because they grew up with them. They maintain those ties there in ways that I just do not, right? And so I'm not going to pretend or even try to really dig specifically into any one community. Instead, what I'm hoping to do tonight is talk about slavery here in the Ag Reserve from the late 1700s through the Civil War, as a setup for maybe a part 2 next time, where we can talk about kind of post-Civil War, what happens when all of a sudden these formerly enslaved people now find themselves with some form of freedom and ability to set up their own communities, and how does that kind of take shape and play out. So tonight we're going to focus kind of on the up to the Civil War piece, and go from there. So that's kind of my game plan. We'll see how that works. I'm kind of using you guys as a little bit of my experiment run before I give this presentation in a few weeks. So please, any feedback at the end is more than welcomed. This picture here, if you're wondering what this structure is, so this is actually the quarters of the enslaved peoples who lived at, or who were forced to live and worked at the Annington plantation. Annington is the home built in 1813. It's that big old brick house right out there by White's Ferry that's kind of up on top of the hill that you always pass when you're driving out to White's Ferry. And this picture was taken in the 1930s, but the structure is very much still with us, which I think is really cool that we have this. And I'll show you some pictures of some other places. I think one of the really unique aspects of the Ag Reserve is that when it comes to the issue of slavery, we have a significant amount of remaining structures tied to the legacy of slavery that are in many cases restored and in good shape, and really can serve as some really great teachers, especially for kids and who are thinking about that issue or starting to learn about it and have the ability to get out to these properties. So overall, if you kind of forget everything else here, the point that I really want to kind of pound home tonight is this idea that when we talk about slavery and we see it depicted in movies and we read about it in books, I think many cases it's this view of this thing that took place, in the Deep South. It happened in Louisiana and Mississippi and Georgia. And that's true, but it also happened right here. And I think while people in these parts, in Poolesville and in the larger Ag Reserve, kind of understand that, I don't think most appreciate the extent to which slavery was prevalent here in these parts. We're not talking about something that is just, a few enslaved peoples here and there. We're talking about significant numbers of people who are enslaved right here in the town of Poolesville. And I just really want to make sure that that point is made clear. This is a very significant issue. I think you could easily argue that the ripple effects of that are still present with us in the way that the town is set up today, in the way that our Black communities are kind of pushed on the outskirts of town. The legacies of this are still very much here. And you're going to hear me, as best as possible, use the term enslaved or enslaved peoples and not slaves. And that's a really intentional decision on my part. That's not some, effort to be politically correct or anything like that. It's an effort to be precise about a pretty complex issue. And I use this term, and I think increasingly I'm seeing people use it, because when we talk about human beings who were enslaved, they are not slaves, they were humans. They were enslaved by other humans, right? And so it's just kind of it's a minor little tweak on the wording there, but when I say that, that's the reason I'm saying it. It's not just some kind of random accident that I'm throwing out there. Okay, so a bit of history on slavery and along the East Coast and in Maryland. So the initial enslaved peoples from Africa arrived in in what is now the United States, or at the time, North America, the colonies, around 1619. And the first enslaved peoples in Maryland arrived to the colony on the Eastern Shore down by St. Mary's City in the 1640s. This map is from 1685. And what you can see here is Maryland as a colony, which is true for most of the colonies, right? We start along the Atlantic Ocean, along the coast. This is where the settlements are built. This is where a lot of this is where the crop cultivation is taking part. And the earliest settlers in Maryland were largely focused on tobacco, right? So they were using this fertile soil along the Chesapeake and along the Atlantic to cultivate this tobacco crop. And what happens over time is kind of a confluence of a couple of different things. One, as you can see out in the western part of Maryland, it's largely unmapped. You don't have a whole lot of detail there. You don't have a whole lot of indications of, population groups out in this part. At this point in time, where we now kind of consider to be the ag reserve is largely uninhabited by Europeans, but it's certainly inhabited by Native Americans at this point, right? There's actually a number of architectural and archaeological sites up and down the Potomac here around Poolesville that tie back to Native American villages, which is a really interesting topic that actually I think deserves a whole lot more discussion on. It was something that I know Christine Ray briefly touched on last week when she gave her presentation, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider. But over time, and I'm not a farmer, but my understanding is that cultivating tobacco is quite harsh on the soil, and that you can really only do that for so long before you kind of wear out the earth. And so we have a combination of things take place. One is after multiple generations of farming tobacco in the same land, the land starts to yield less and less of a productive crop. The two is the colonies are getting bigger. And three is there's more exploration and mapping of the Potomac River to see how far north it goes than there had been when Maryland was first settled. And so as a result of this, what we start seeing is this westward movement, especially in the mid 1700s into the late 1700s. And it's really, this is largely the reason why when we look at some of the oldest homes here in the Ag Reserve, a lot of times we're talking about houses like Mount Carmel is a good example, the John Poole house, right? You'll notice that a lot of them show up and are built in the 1780s, 1790s timeframe. We had settlers showing up earlier than that. I know we had individuals in these parts in the 1740s, but for the most part, the structures they were building at that point were not very permanent in nature, so they did not last kind of the test of time, as opposed to some of the structures built in the late 1700s and onward, which were more sturdy, better materials, and in many cases are still with us to look at. And so by the late 1700s, you have this movement of settlers from the eastern part of Maryland and along the Chesapeake out to what we now consider the Ag Reserve along the Potomac, looking again for that more fertile ground upon which to cultivate new tobacco crops. And of course, as these settlers moved westward, so too do the enslaved persons that are under their control. And so that's where we see slavery come into this part of the Ag Reserve in the late 1700s. I've seen records as early as 1783, but there was probably enslaved peoples here even earlier than that. And this, I think these numbers are really, I find them quite eye-opening. Montgomery County, unfortunately, I don't have, census data looking specific. I'm sure I could do some work that'd be difficult and rough, but I don't have good census data just for kind of this part of the Ag Reserve. But for Montgomery County, slavery is a incredibly prevalent thing through the late 1700s and the first half of the 1800s. You can see here, this is percent of county residents enslaved. I mean, we have periods of time in the early 1800s where around or more than 40% of the population is enslaved. So this is not a couple of people. I mean, this is a significant amount of people. Now, granted, the county is much smaller than we're talking, 15 to 20,000 people total. But still, that's a significant amount of enslavement here in Montgomery County. And as we see these trend, and I would just note, this is from census data, but of course, these records, especially, kind of to the left side of the screen as we're in the very early 1800s, they are likely not I know that they are not precise. So those percentages are maybe not spot on, but I think the point is that we have this significant percentage of the population showing just how prevalent it was here in these parts. So despite the fact that Maryland, is pretty far north relative to some of these other kind of southern states, slavery was very much a thing here, alive and well in Montgomery County. And you can see through the early 1800s, we have a boom in wheat. So we start seeing this transition from tobacco to wheat, which required a lot of manpower to cultivate that crop. Over time, we start seeing some machinery come into play, which might account for a little bit of that dip. And then as we move towards the Civil War, and then obviously, emancipation in 1864, where technically the number of enslaved drops to zero at that point. And what was slavery like here in the town of Poolesville? We are pretty lucky. We have a specific account from an individual by the name of Phillip Johnson. Phillip was born in 1847. So he was 17 or so when he was freed. So he spent the first 17 years of his life as property to the Chiswell family. You can see Dr. Stephen Chiswell in the upper right. Stephen Newton Chiswell was a doctor here in town in Poolesville. He also was the owner of Annington, which was that property I mentioned at the very beginning. And you can see that there in the bottom left. My understanding is, so Chiswell, that was already a very prominent family. And he then married into the Trundle family, which was also quite prominent. I want to say it's Otho, but it might be a different Trundle. They made a lot of wealth out of that wheat boom, which allowed them to build Annington in 1813. And then Stephen Newton Chiswell married into the family. And as a result of that, he was already from a prominent family and became even more prominent and wealthy. He had his doctor's office in town. So that picture in the upper center, for those of you that are, longtime residents, that is, you might remember this. This is right kind of across the street from the old town hall. If you look in the bottom center picture I think that's from like 1909, you can actually see in the red box. Oh yeah, you're right. It's not a Chiswell. Yeah, sorry. It's from the White family. Jim Poole is, thank you for spot checking me. Yeah, Dr. Stephen White. Anyway, in the bottom right, you can see in the box, that is the home there that you're seeing in the upper center. So it's right there in the middle of town. It was torn down in, I want to say 85. But that was the location of Dr. White's home and medical practice in town. And as the story goes with Phillip, so he is brought to Annington as a young boy. He's enslaved there. And in 1937, he gives this account as part of an interview. And he talks about being brought there and the overseer at Annington, and the overseer at these properties was the individual kind of responsible for keeping the enslaved kind of in line, and also ensuring kind of managing the overall farming operations at the plantation. He was apparently quite cruel to Phillip, and as a result, Dr. White's wife actually had Phillip moved to this house in Poolesville. So he spent his younger years and into his teenage years here in the center of town at that structure. And in the interview, it's interesting. I mean, he talks, born in 1847, so he's, 14 years old or so when the Civil War kicks off. And we'll talk about it in a minute, but there's a lot of troop movement here in the town of Poolesville during the Civil War. And he's literally right in the center of town. And in this interview, he talks about seeing these troops moving back and forth. He talks about an incident where he specifically sees a Union soldier shoot and kill a Confederate soldier in the middle of town. So he had, quite the experience growing up here, enslaved by the White family. And then once emancipated, he plays a role in helping to settle the Sugarland community, goes on to be a preacher for a number of years, has, I want to say, 10 or 11 children. And he died in the late 1930s, and is buried at the Sugarland Historic Cemetery out there on Sugarland Road. So really an individual that saw, experienced, lived enslavement firsthand, saw what that was like here in these parts, and we have an account to learn from. What I would say, and you can find the account or this interview pretty easily. One thing to note, though, is they were going around in the 1930s as part of the Works Progress Administration, doing a bunch of interviews with formerly enslaved to try to capture their experiences. And it's worth remembering that it's the 1930s, right? I mean, you can imagine sitting down as a formerly enslaved person in a country that, where racism is still incredibly overt and apparent. And now you're being asked by a white guy about your experience, enslaved. There's going to be a certain power imbalance there in that conversation. So you will see him talk about things like how nice Dr. White was and how wonderful his wife was to them. And I'm not suggesting that that's not necessarily true, but we should just kind of consider the nature upon which he's giving this interview and take that into consideration, because it's quite possible that's, he's not exactly incentivized at that point in time to tell a completely honest portrayal about the way that he was treated. And so I mentioned, the amazing thing about this place that we live, especially when it comes to slavery and to kind of the evolution of Black communities following the Civil War, is that we have these fairly well-defined Black communities outside of Poolesville, where descendants of the settlers in many cases still live or still very much connected to these sites. We have these large old homes where many individuals were enslaved before going off to settle, those Black communities. And at a lot of these old homes, we have the actual structures that were built to house the enslaved, and they are in many cases still with us, right? And so we have this really interesting opportunity to be able to look at someone like Phillip Johnson and his life experience and really kind of trace that experience to some extent on the ground through physical sites and properties and locations, right? I mean, we can see where he was born, and we can see where he worked out at Annington, and we can see where he went and lived in Poolesville, and we can see the community that he helped establish afterwards, and we can see where he's buried now. And that's I think a pretty unique opportunity that I'm not sure exists in many other places like it does here. So a lot of these old homes have these structures still standing. Homeowners have done a good job of, maintaining them. I would say I always find it somewhat interesting. A lot of times when I'll look at one of these buildings and I'll say, I know what they are, but I'll ask the homeowner like, oh, what's that structure? And they typically say, oh, it's the guest house. I was like, that's an interesting way of defining that place, right? I'm not sure, a guest, I suppose, in some ways. But I'm really glad that they are still with us and maintained. So when, just kind of the larger issue of slavery here in Poolesville and in the Ag Reserve, one of the things that we can see throughout the early 1800s, and this is just a few examples, there's plenty more, but are repeated and frequent newspaper articles where these property owners are basically putting out classified ads looking for their enslaved peoples who have run away from the plantation, and asking for rewards to be given if they are returned to the site. And it's it's a fascinating look because in many of these, I know they're really hard to read, but we're talking specifically about Poolesville. And a lot of these names are names that we will see kind of tied to a bunch of these old structures that we've talked about in prior presentations. But this is happening, throughout the early 1800s. And I don't think this is unique to Poolesville, right? This is, the Underground Railroad was something that is, frequently talked about throughout the South. And of course, the enslaved were running away from properties all over the place. But it's fascinating to kind of see it here in the place that you live. And also, consider Maryland is an interesting geographic space for slavery to have taken place. We've got, the state of Pennsylvania not too far north. We've got the Potomac as a waterway that could potentially help you get there. And so there's this constant fear amongst these property owners about the ability of their enslaved property getting away. And I've seen some accounts that try to make the claim that as a result of this geography, these property owners were somehow nicer to their enslaved people. I've seen much more accounts to say, don't believe that for 1 minute. That's not true. So, I think it's just it's an interesting thing to think about, kind of like where we are space-wise. And if you have to run from here to Pennsylvania, it's a whole lot easier to do than if you're in Louisiana trying to get to Pennsylvania, right? Okay, and then we get to 1860, and this is something, I've said this before, and I always just think it's kind of like a interesting statistic, but Lincoln is running for president, and he's not popular in these parts. So this part of the Ag Reserve is Medley's there. We are the Medley voting district. Now, as you can see, it doesn't look like there was a whole lot of voting taking place in that election to begin with out in these parts. But Lincoln didn't get any votes. And this town, and to some extent, the entire county of Montgomery County was very Southern leaning as the war began to kick off. A lot of Southern sympathies. Part of that, related to the prevalence of slavery here in this part of Maryland. And as we'll see in a second, in the Civil War, when we look at individuals going off to fight in the Civil War from these parts, it's almost universally going to fight for the Confederacy, right? I think there's maybe a couple of examples that I can kind of point to where it might look like someone joined the Union, but for the most part, the individuals that choose to fight in the Civil War are going across the river to fight for Virginia. So this line up top, by the way, and then the war came, I always think it's an interesting line. And I wasn't sure where it came from. It actually comes from Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1864, where he is kind of talking about, almost reminiscing, looking back on his initial inauguration in 1860, and thinking about kind of the futility of the war and the clear signs at that point that the war was coming. And now sitting there 4 years later, after all of this death and destruction and some indications that maybe the war will end relatively soon, but just kind of some reflection there. This picture here is taken in the center of Poolesville. So this is like if you were standing at the old town hall looking towards the four-way intersection. And if you look closely, what you see out there is the Dr. Thomas Pool House and the, I think it's the Frederick Pool House there. Jim, feel free to correct me on that. Those two homes are very much still standing, right? And there's actually, for those of you on the Poolesville Now and Then page, there was a very recent discussion on this picture. The troops here, I've seen a lot of different things. My understanding is it's troops from Minnesota, Union troops here in the center of town that we're seeing. And I think this picture was taken around 1862. but I'm willing to be corrected on that. And so during the war, we have this really interesting scenario taking place where we have an area, this part of the ag reserve, that is heavily kind of trafficked, and in many cases, there's many encampments from Union soldiers in these parts because of the strategic importance of this territory, right? We've got some significant river crossings from Virginia, and the Union Army, of course, does not want the Confederates to come across the river and move down on Washington, D.C. So this becomes really key terrain for the Union to hold. And so we find ourselves in this position during the Civil War where we've got all these Union soldiers around. We've got a number of different Union encampments that are kind of coming and going depending on the units moving in and out of the area. And at the same time, we have these large structures like this one, which is Chapelle, that are lived in and inhabited by strong Southern sympathizers who have enslaved peoples working on the property. This letter here, and I know you can't read it, but it's essentially a dispatch from a captain in the Union Army writing back to his commander. They had received these intelligence reports that there was a bunch of contraband out here at Chapelle, and he's writing back to tell him that they went in, they searched the enslaved quarters, wherever that was. It's no longer standing here, unfortunately, but found a bunch of government uniform items, some whiskey, I think a Colt revolver. He's basically giving account of this and bringing those items back. So there's this, we see this constant, frequency of searches of these properties all across the ag reserve. A number of these homes that are still with us, had Union troops moving through them at different points in time, trying to look for contraband or, rebel soldiers from Poolesville who were returning home and spending time with their families for a bit and then trying to sneak back out to Virginia before they got caught. So it's just, the wartime conditions are quite fascinating. And one of the interesting things here about Chapelle specifically is that the Union encampment was essentially right across the street. And what we have over time is a number of enslaved people from this property, as well as a couple of others in the area, actually running away from the home into the Union camp. And many believe that actually the Black community of Jonesville was actually started that way, that they ran to the camp, they had some kind of safe passage or protection, and following the war, they essentially set up Jonesville in the area where that Union encampment had been, right? So kind of a fascinating story. There's some evidence of that. I haven't seen kind of the full kind of evidence of that laid out, but it makes a lot of sense. Someone asked, where is Chapelle? So this location is, it's right on 28th and Jerusalem Road, right where they meet. So it's right, if you know where like the beauty spot is, it's kind of past there if you're driving the 28. The home sits way back off the road. It's very hard to see from the road. And just for what it's worth, just because I always talk about old houses, the Chapelle that existed during the Civil War was just this central portion of the home. These wings were added in the 1950s, so they are not original. And I'll show you an old picture of it in a second. Yeah. And I don't know if I'm supposed to like reveal this. I think some people already know this, but I know that, there's been a lot of talk of Landmade, which is a new brewery that's supposed to be opening up here in the next few weeks, I think. Landmade will be at this property, which is pretty cool. So I don't know how close it's going to be to the home, but you might have an opportunity to see the home up close. So as the war is winding down in late 1864, Maryland ratifies its new state constitution, and the enslaved are emancipated. This is, the direct line from the Constitution, essentially declaring the enslaved free. And so, as a result, when we kind of pull back and look at this, what we have here is if we sit back in 1860, we have a number of these properties, and you could call them plantations. They're not kind of the plantations of the Deep South, but in some ways they're plantations. All of these have enslaved peoples working on them, and this is just a small subset. There are many more structures like this. And so we have this, and then what happens is in 1864, we have emancipation. There's a number of years immediately following the Civil War where these Black communities don't seem to show up. And I think that that's potentially because these formerly enslaved persons already all of a sudden being free need some time to perhaps collect funds or organize to start to create these communities. So we start seeing the communities show up in the early 1870s. And so what happens here is in 1870, we start seeing them pop up kind of around town. And, it's no coincidence that they're kind of out in these different quadrants of the ag-reserve, largely almost clustered around where some of these larger homes were, where many of them had worked or continued to work after the Civil War, just not technically enslaved. Although obviously, during the era of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, where, certainly technically free by law, but still many issues and challenges associated that we'll talk about next time. So you can see, so these homes, I'll just go back so you can see where they're located. So in the upper left, we have Inverness, built in 1818. That's out at the blinking stoplight in Dickerson. Out here, one below that, center left, is Annington, 1813, that we talked about. Bottom left, that's East Oaks, built in 1824. That was home to the Young family. It was also the location of a Union encampment site, which again was an interesting spot with enslaved persons and Union soldiers in close proximity. Down in the center, we have the Chiswell home, Chiswell inheritance, from 1796. In the upper center, we have Mount Carmel up in Dickerson. This is associated with the Gott family and kind of came around in the late 1700s. Upper right there, that's that initial Chapelle structure, right? So that's what it looked like in the 1930s, much more original. We have Darnall Place below that. And then bottom right is Montevideo, which was built by the Peter family in 1828. So all of these structures and many more had a number of enslaved working at them throughout the early 1800s up until 1864. And then we have these properties. And so next month, what I want to kind of transition to is, okay, we've been through that experience. Emancipation has occurred. What does it look like when these formerly enslaved start setting up these communities, and then really what does that evolution look like throughout the late 1800s in through the 1900s? I want to show you all some actual newspaper clippings and discussions that were taking place in the 1950s during desegregation, because that was quite a experience here in town, and not for good reasons. And I think it's really interesting and frankly important to look at. And so we'll dig into that when we next meet. Let's see here. Okay, so totally switching tone. Oh, Darnall property, Melissa, is it is, so this one, you've passed it a billion times. So if you're leaving town on 107, you kind of go down, it dips down. It's technically a bridge, although you don't necessarily feel like you're on a bridge. And there's a driveway off to the left, and it goes back there, and it's back in the woods. Actually just had really good friends purchase that property, which has been awesome because I've gotten to go out there a bunch of times. But yeah, so it's right there. Okay, so separately, so this weekend I am on Saturday. I'm sure some of you maybe already have tickets, and that would be awesome. But I'm running a home tour of these 4 properties. There are the Solomon Simpson plant. At 3 of these 4, there was definitely slavery taking place. Lindenwood, I'm not so sure about. But if you were unable to get tickets, we did sell it out. But if you were unable to get tickets and you're still interested in attending, I will tell you all this and just don't tell anybody else. Just show up at the John Poole House at 11:30 on Saturday. And once you give a little donation to HMD, I will make sure that you get a wristband and can go explore these properties if you're interested. I think it's going to be a good time. It's going to be pretty free flowing, so you'll have a lot of freedom to spend as much or as little time at each of these properties, kind of exploring on your own. But yeah, I just wanted to put that out there in case anybody missed it. Any questions?
Feel free to either put them in the chat or unmute and ask questions on your own at this time.
Hi, Kenny. Can
Hi.
you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. This is Courtney. So I had a quick question for you. You talked earlier about, I think it was White. You were originally, I think, said Chiswell, but then
Yeah,
I think it got
yep,
changed
yep.
to White. But anyway, that family then intermarried or started to intertwine with the Trundle family.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that the Trundle family is where Trundle Road got its name.
Yes.
Okay, so I live on Trundle Road. My husband and I own a farm here.
Oh.
And I'm curious because I didn't hear any mention about Trundle Hall, which is actually the original house that Trundle Road runs up to. It used to be the driveway of the original house, Trundle Hall.
Yeah, is that the one that is at the very, very end of the road, kind of behind a gate and way back there? It's kind of like Victorian in nature.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so
It used to go all the way through. The road used to go all the way through to Club Hollow. It doesn't go all the way through now. It's a dead end at that gate.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have a
if you
dirty
look at the plats, yes, I do.
Yeah.
So yeah, very nice lady. Okay. So if you look at the plats for this area, it's actually very interesting because you have a lot of the very small sort of sharecropper plots that were along the edges of Trundle Road, which is right across from where our farm driveway is. And on those, they're all small little plots, and they're actually in like the least desirable land. You know, it's kind of like swampy and sort of, I think it's a lot of it is now, I forget what the word is, but you can't use it for building or anything. It's like protected for birds and things. And so what I've been told is that's all the original, like the sharecroppers plots where they used to have. What's that?
They were given to them after.
Given to them after the Civil War is what we were told. So I think it's very rich in the history right in this area here. I just don't know much about it, and I'm very curious about it. We're like you, we're from the area originally, although a little bit further, my husband and I from Darnestown, and then his parents on Montevideo. So right local people. Yeah. And you know, we're just very curious because we live here.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, and there are, aside from the kind of defined, Black communities around town, there are a number of old, I think there might even be one or two back where you live, but a number of old kind of log houses in the woods that I've come across over time. And I think it's hard because we don't have a lot of written, evidence of it, but I think in many cases, those were, structures built by African Americans in the late 1800s as kind of, almost sharecroppers or tenant farmers or whatever term is appropriate there. But a lot of them are still with us. Most of them are, long abandoned, but they're really, really fascinating to take a look at. And yeah, I mean, to your point on just kind of learning more, that's always like the challenge here. And I've said this before, but like, I think it's fascinating to think about how wealth, colors, and biases are understanding of history, right? When we think about telling the story of the past and the ag reserve, it's so easy to spend a lot of time talking about these like predominant white families, like the Whites and the Chiswells and the Brundles, because they had the means to build these large homes that could withstand 200 or 300 years, and they're still with us. Whereas when we look at, the formerly enslaved building these homes out of whatever materials they could find, that's a really interesting and compelling story, but those homes are long, long gone in most cases, right? And so we lose a little bit of that record of something tangible to look at and think about and learn from. And so that's always kind of the challenge here, is like trying to figure out who knows what. And we just had, as some of our long-standing residents of these different Black communities are getting older in age, and we're losing them. A lot of these stories kind of go with them, and so it's really important that we're kind of capturing them where possible.
Mm-hmm. And as you know, Trundle Road is like right across the street from where we have, the little community that I understand. Yeah, the Martinsburg community with
Yep.
the church and the old schoolhouse and all that stuff. So,
yep.
Yeah, I think it's very rich with history.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. And looking forward to seeing you on Saturday.
Oh, yeah.
I'll talk to you then.
Great. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Kenny, George Coakley.
Hey.
I know a couple years ago, several years ago, one of our members at Isaac Walton League did some archaeology and historical looking back. And I think he found out that there were like 21 enslaved people on our property at one time or another, and the old log cabin that's there was basically the manager's house. But the owner didn't have a nice home out here or anything. He lived in Georgetown. Well, I guess there were a number of wealthy individuals that lived in DC, but had farms or just acreage out here to grow crops and generate money and stuff and everything, and would have no manor home or anything, but just slave quarters and maybe a little house for a manager or something to receive.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these like plantations were just, they were essentially just agricultural businesses, right? So.
I see a question in the chat that says, Kenny, will you address the effect of education in Poolesville during the 1950s and desegregation?
Yeah. So that's actually, that's really what I want to spend time talking about, is some of the African-American schools that were built in the early 1900s, or even in the late 1800s in some cases. And then kind of talking about a little bit about Taylor Elementary School out in Boyd's, which is quite an important site for a number of reasons. And then we'll talk about the actual desegregation of Poolesville High School in 1956, which was it was a very big deal in these parts and made a lot of news. We have a lot of kind of news that we can pull from and newspaper articles to look at that event.
I have a question about the two homes in Dawsonville, right off 107. The one that used to be owned by Dr. Smith, Dr. Fawcett.
Okay.
You know which one? Yeah, that used to have some structures behind it. And I think the people that own it now might have taken most of them down.
Are you talking about Darnall Place, or?
I don't know if it has a name. It's the house that Dr. Fawcett used to own.
I'm not sure which one that is.
If you're going down 107 and you come to that little intersection at Dawsonville before you get to 28, and you make the left on that little road that goes through, it's the one on the right.
Oh, okay. I know that house.
Yeah. There used to be wooden structures all behind it. And I think the family that owns it now must have taken them down because they were in poor condition. And I was just wondering if those had been enslaved quarters, or.
I don't know. I mean, I don't think that house is old, but I actually don't think it's pre-Civil War. I think it's probably
Okay,
because it's Victorian in nature. So I think it's
yeah,
probably
that's true.
1870s or 80s.
Right,
Um,
okay,
But that doesn't mean, I mean, there's a lot of old homes right out there, so it doesn't mean that they're
yeah,
crazy structures back there. But
okay. I was just curious. Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah.
I see another comment in the chat from Jim Poole saying, in the 1860s census, I counted 1,600 whites and the same for slaves, about 30 free blacks in Medley.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I know Jim Poole is a wealth of knowledge around these parts, and you know, perhaps the last name of Poole probably gives that away, but I know he's done a lot of work with looking at census records, and I've seen that 1860 census. That's a pretty good one in terms of having a lot of detail that you can dig into. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah, and then Steve asked about the Trundles owning property around Monocacy Aqueduct, same family as the Trundles. Yes, yeah. So Otho Trundle owns the home out on, or did, he built the home out on, I think it's on Martinsburg Road maybe, but it's out there and it sits up high on a bluff. It's got that really cool old stone barn across the street from it. It's out by like where out in Dickerson, where they're, you know, kind of dumping all that coal ash and making that like artificial looking mountain out there. It's out there, but yeah, I think the Trundles, and this is true of the whites as well. I think when they built the C&O Canal coming through there in the 1830s, it actually cut through parts of their property, and so they got some payment from the U.S. government for that. But yeah, a lot of cool old structures out in those parts.
Do we have any more questions? Feel free to either drop them in the chat or unmute and ask them. Well, of course, as always, if you think of any questions later, you can email them to info@poolesvilleseniors.org and we can pass them on to Kenny for you. I hope you all enjoyed tonight's presentation as much as I did and learned something new. If you think of any questions, like I said, email us or get them to Kenny. I know he has a Facebook page now for historic properties. If you'd like to unmute or turn on your camera to say goodbye, now is the time. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, please leave a like and a comment. I'd like to thank Kenny for his presentation, as well as our ongoing sponsors and private contributors that help us keep our programs going, because we love putting them on for you. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider joining us for more upcoming events. This time next week, we'll be back with A Little Birdie Told Me. You can go to our website at poolesvilleseniors.org for more info and registration. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Kenny.
Thank you.
Thank you.